Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. My name is Jay Parsons. I'm a Farm and Ranch Management Specialist with Nebraska Extension and the Center for Ag Profitability at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Coming to you live today from my Advanced Farm Management classroom here on the East Campus in Lincoln, Nebraska. So I'm joined by a good group of students who came in early to partake in this adventure. And really excited to have two of my favorite guest speakers on. Mary Drewnoski, she's a beef systems specialist in the Department of Animal Science. Hi, Mary. Good to have you on. And Daren Redfearn, he's in agronomy and horticulture, where he's a professor and extension and forage crop residue specialist. So hi, Daren. Good to have you on here today, too.
Thanks, Jay.
Just like to remind everyone that this webinar is being recorded. You can access the recording and find an archive of all of our past webinars and a schedule of upcoming webinars on our Center for Ag Profitability website. That URL is cap.unl.edu. So cap spelled cap.unl.edu. Now for today's webinar and our topic at hand, with forage supplies low and nitrogen fertilizer prices high, a natural question being asked by many people this year is, should I fertilize my hay or pasture? So this webinar is going to discuss expected responses to nitrogen fertilizer and how to estimate if extra forage is worth the cost for smooth bromegrass and other annual forages. And we'll have plenty of time for questions at the end, I'm sure. And Daren and Mary are always full of information. So feel free to pipe up as we go along in terms of typing in your questions into the question box. And I think Daren is going to start us off. And then I got a slide that he asked me to speak on. And then Mary's going to talk too. So feel free to type questions in at any time while we're doing this. And we'll have a good discussion at the end. But for now, I'll turn the floor over to Dr. Daren Redfearn.
Right, Jay. Thanks very much. Jay did a very nice job of describing what where we're headed today, and this is a very relevant topic. Lot to think about. I've got, including this title slide. There's 12 slides here, but we do have an awful lot of ground to cover today. So I do think it's important, as you have a question that pops up, go ahead and ask that, and we can either give you an indication that we'll answer that a little bit later in the presentation, or we may want to go ahead and speak to it at that moment. But again, we're going to be looking primarily at fertilizing smooth bromegrass pastures this year, or the possibilities of fertilizing them this year. I wanted to talk just briefly a little bit about some of the smooth bromegrass management practices. One of the things about smooth bromegrass, it's an introduced cool season grass. It's a sod forming grass, but it can become sod bound. So effectively, for it to avoid becoming sod bound, it does have a requirement to be fertilized with nitrogen. Sod-bound Bermuda grass is effectively a condition that results or reduces the formation of new buds that produce tillers. So not fertilizing 1 year doesn't cause it to become sod-bound. It's a combination of low fertility over several years. As we'd indicated, smooth bromegrass is responsive to nitrogen fertilization. Smooth bromegrass is very responsive to nitrogen fertilization and can respond to very high rates. Some of the other things that oftentimes we know, but we forget a little bit, because smooth bromegrass is a cool season grass. About 75% of the growth in non-irrigated pastures we can expect to occur by mid-June. If you do a quick little calculation, that's about 45 days away. So there's not a lot of growth period left yet to accumulate that 75% growth. For hay harvest, typically we like to see that harvested at early heading in mid to late May. The reason that is because it does leave a little bit of time there for regrowth to occur before mid-June. So basically, you've got about 30 days of regrowth there. Some of the things that we often forget about smooth brome grass is that it does not respond well to a severe harvest, either through hay harvest or grazing. Typically, what we see with a hay harvest is that it does not regrow very well at all. Leaving a 3 to 4 inch double height at hay harvest will allow that to regrow some during the remainder of the production season. Same type of response for grazing. Typically, we like to leave a little bit of residual growth there, in particular if we're in a rotational grazing system. This next point, I'll qualify that a little bit, is I don't think there's much of a way in a non-irrigated system that we'll be able to meet this 3 to 4 animal unit months per acre production period this year. We'll look at a little bit of irrigated data in a bit, and in irrigated smooth Bromegrass pastures, we can far exceed that production. So there's a lot going on there with the Bermuda grass. And so what precipitated a lot of this webinar today, the current situation we're at, those of you that have purchased hay or are looking to purchase hay prices are quite high. They're still around $200 per ton. Nitrogen fertilizer costs, while they're high, they're not as high as they have been recently. They have moderated a bit. Currently, they're somewhere in the neighborhood of about 80 cents per pound of nitrogen. Forage supplies have dwindled, so we're looking for forage production. So based on this, one of the things that I think we would like to answer today, that I would ask is, okay, knowing what you know now, what's your next move? Well, the next move is we need to know what the weather is going to do, right? The weather can really dictate a lot of help us in a lot of our decision makings. And I went in and pulled this seasonal drought outlook up yesterday. I had some internal conflicts whether I was going to talk a little bit about weather predictions, but I think given the decision making process that's needed, I do think this is important. And so effectively, if you look right in the middle of that map there, you'll find Nebraska, and they've got it tinted gray. And effectively, what that gray tint means is that it means drought is going to remain, but it's going to improve. And if our conditions are going to improve, that means that it's going to rain a little bit at some point in time. At least here in eastern Nebraska, we have a small chance tonight and tomorrow. I don't know that it's going to get anywhere close to curing the drought, but every little bit helps. If you look around the fringes, you can see some green shades. Effectively, what that is the drought removal is likely. But if you go down to the Kansas border and you look about 800 miles south of Nebraska, you see a brown shade there. And effectively, what that indicates is they're predicting the drought to persist. And what's a little intriguing to me is that persisting drought and the improving drought is right together there. So I think the conditions, at least through at least what I can see, the conditions at least through the end of July, while that drought conditions may improve a little bit, they're not going to be eliminated by any stretch of the imagination. If we're looking at full production of Bermuda grass, some of the work we see is that it's going to require 16 inches of moisture. That can be a combination of moisture that's stored in the soil and also growing season rainfall.
Daren, you mean smooth brome?
Go ahead. Brome. Yeah, what'd I say?
Smooth brome, Bermuda.
Oh man, I got an Oklahoma flashback there. So yes, smooth brome grass. I was thinking a little bit about the warm season pastures also. A lot of this falls the same. A lot of the same principles are true, but effectively, what we're looking at this year with these variable precipitation, I think our nitrogen fertilization rates might need to be adjusted downward. In particular, if drier weather persists. What we'll look at in a few minutes is that the economics are going to favor fertilizing smooth brome grass. And this is a if, it's a big if moisture is not going to be limiting. So this is from Neb Guide G 1977, and on the left side of the graph, if you look at our cool season grasses, basically what we're looking at is fertilizer application during the early part of spring growth, and right now this is the basically represents the beginning of May, so we're effectively at the tail end of fertilizer application. Typically, what you'll see is a recommendation for spring production on non-irrigated smooth brome grass is about 60 to 80 pounds of nitrogen per acre. And we see this a lot coming out of a drought, especially moisture tends to compensate for some low fertility occasionally. So typically what we see coming out of a drought is a lot of the other soil characteristics, in particular pH and soil phosphorus and soil potassium may also be low. So the comparison on the right-hand figure is a comparison of irrigated brome grass to dryland brome grass. If you look at the zero nitrogen rate, what you'll see here is almost a nearly probably a 1,500 pound difference between dryland in the eastern Nebraska and also the irrigated, where most of that occurs out in the central part of the state. A couple things to note that really stick out: that red line representing the irrigated Bermuda grass is it does respond to quite a heavy nitrogen rate, up to 240 pounds of nitrogen per acre, although it does start to moderate a bit. They're about 150 or 160 pounds. If you look at the dryland production, it levels out much quicker, starts to level out here around 80 pounds of production. So there's quite a difference in recommendation depending on whether or not the brome grass is irrigated or is produced under dryland. This gives a little bit of indication, just to point out that this is some data looking at the effect of nitrogen fertilization on irrigated brome grass and orchard grass yield, and it does show the increasing response of nitrogen from 0 up to 300 pounds was the upper treatment. Certainly don't recommend these high nitrogen rates. If you look at the optimum nitrogen rate under irrigated brome grass, that's going to be somewhere around 150 pounds of nitrogen per acre. Again, I'd like to point out that this is data that was conducted back in the early 70s up in Holt County. Looking a bit at the yield response of cool season species. These are harvest for harvest, and again, it's an average of 8 irrigated cool season species conducted by Jerry Valesky in North Platte in 2003. Again, if you look at that spring production, that first harvest was around toward the mid to late part of May. That was almost 2.5 tons of production per acre during the spring. If you look at the early summer, midsummer, late summer, and fall production, it is moderated quite a bit down to about 1.5 tons of production per acre. However, I'd like to point out that over the growing season, which was extended and enhanced by the ability of the brome grass to use nitrogen and moisture, the total AUMs produced for around 17 animal unit months over a course of about 5 or 6 months here. So under good growing conditions, you can produce an enormous amount of these cool season perennial grasses. Looking briefly at the forage cost, and again to point out, this was the 1 ton an acre that was taken from the UNL research study So what we've got here is we've got a fertility study that was conducted in the University of Nebraska without moisture stress. In this case, these non-fertilized pastures produced about 1.5 tons of hay yield per acre. So it was non-fertilized, and you got 1.5 tons. Their next treatment was basically this 70-pound of nitrogen rate here that increased that production a ton. Okay. And then kind of out of curiosity, I threw in this 140 pounds out here. Would not recommend that under a dryland situation at all. But if you look at fertilizer costs, you might expect that at the lower rates, the nitrogen is going to be cheaper. Application costs are consistent across all those fertilizer applications. Also, as you would expect, the total cost per acre would also increase as forage yield increases. Okay. But if you look at the additional cost of additional forage per ton, one of the things that you note is that as yield increases, your input costs sometimes can become more cost effective. Even looking at the 2 ton per acre rate, that would have about a 35-pound of nitrogen application rate per acre. That cost of additional forage per ton is $76. Again, like to recall that current hay prices are somewhere around $200 per ton. So, the one of the other benefits, in addition to increased yield that we see with the fertilization, is that crude protein content can increase. And in this instance, crude protein increased from 4 to 6 percentage units higher in the fertilized smooth brome compared with the non-fertilized smooth brome. So, the point is here of before we move to Jay is, like all grasses, smooth brome grass forage yield is going to be directly linked to the first limiting nutrient for total production. That can be moisture, nitrogen, a combination of moisture, nitrogen, or other nutrients, and even soil pH. But like to, at least I think what we're looking at this year, if accumulated moisture in the soil profile and projected totals only going to be about half of that 16 inches per acre, and you don't have the capability to supplement with irrigation, I think probably one of the probably that rate that we're going to be looking at is going to be somewhere closer to this 35 pounds of nitrogen production or the 35-pound rate of nitrogen production per acre, looking at possibly up to 2 tons per acre. I think given the current conditions that non-fertilized smooth brome grass, it may not reach this 1/2 a ton per acre this year. So those are my thoughts. Jay, would you like to talk a little bit about the marginal cost?
Sure. So, yeah, so I had seen that previous slide that Daren had put together, and then I went ahead and added this to look at it from a marginal cost, marginal value standpoint, because there's a couple of subtle things that kind of sneak past you if you aren't paying attention with these costs. In particular, on his previous slide where you saw the cost going down from $76 to $66 to $61 per ton for the additional forage, that's all in comparison to the non-fertilized option being at 1.5 tons per acre. And so I went ahead and put together here the marginal cost per ton, moving one notch to the left, if you will, here, so that 2 tons an acre option there, which involved putting on 35 pounds of nitrogen, is exactly the same as what he had on the previous screen in terms of it coming out to be $76 a ton, because you're putting on $38 worth of cost to achieve that, and you're getting a 1/2 ton increase in forage. So that looks similar to the other slide. But the subtleness here is that includes that application cost. And once you make that decision to apply and incur that cost of application, then the question becomes, how much do I put on? And so that's what the next two are designed to capture. That is, with $76 in a cost per ton, we can look at a $200 hay price and say, yeah, that certainly justifies to put on fertilizer. And then the question becoming how much? Well, to add to that another 35 pounds to get another half a ton, that's basically a $56 cost per ton for that next ton, right? Because you don't have to incur the or the next half a ton, sorry, because you don't have to incur the $10 application cost again, right? And so because we have a linear response to this in terms of getting basically a half a ton for every 35 pounds of N, from there on out, the way this is currently set up here, just for this nice small picture of it, that marginal cost per ton for each additional unit of fertilizer that you put on it stays at that $56 per ton. So it looks like, hey, I should put on infinite amounts of fertilizer. But keep in mind the bar graphs that Daren had up here earlier, where the response diminishes. And, as he already mentioned, if this were a dryland situation, you've probably pretty much maxed out what you're going to do there. As far as that response goes, under irrigation, you might push it a little bit further. But that response, that lack of response to additional fertilizer is going to bring that marginal cost per ton up considerably as you keep adding fertilizer to it. That might seem a little elementary, but it's always, for me, it really puts things in a perspective that there's that initial decision of, does it make sense to put on fertilizer? Then there's a question of how far do I take it in terms of what's that next unit of fertilizer going to get me as far as a cost per ton equation, and then comparing that to the actual market price. Now, this $200 a ton is pretty optimistic for a lot of the state right now. We've been well over $250 to $300 a ton out on the western half of the state for some time. And given what we see down in Kansas and persistent drought around the country and around our neighboring states, we'll probably continue to see these high hay prices. So right now it looks like a no-brainer to at least put some on, and if it's going to respond, if you have the moisture there for it to respond. It's really a matter of what makes sense when that yield boost begins to drop off. So I just wanted to add that little perspective to it from a marginal standpoint and a comparison for people to think about as they think about this decision.
I think there's a couple questions in the chat that might be worth addressing at this point. One question was about, Daren, your comment about the sod-bound pastures, and they were asking, would grazing break up the thatch and prevent the grass from becoming sod-bound?
Grazing by itself will not do that. Thinking ahead a little bit, what you're, as part of that soil biology piece there, you're looking at trying to get that nitrogen cycling in that system. And so the nitrogen has to come from somewhere, at least a lot in these smooth bromegrass pastures. You can do that through nitrogen fertilization or by including legumes in those pastures. However, once they become sod bound, the quickest way to alleviate that is through an application of nitrogen. Effectively, as I mentioned earlier, what's happening is a lot of that plant physiology that creates those tiller buds isn't occurring, and so you've got a lower number of tiller buds producing fewer tillers every year, and so your yield over time is going to decrease.
Thanks, Daren. There was one other one which was about manure, which I think is an interesting question as well. So considerations for fertilizing with manure.
Right? Yeah, the thing about the manure is, if that's available, that's a pretty good option as well. There will be nitrogen in that manure. Other nutrients, I think over time, you increase the water holding. All the good things that come along with manure in cropland also occur in pastures. The difference between the manure and or between the organic and the inorganic fertilizer, the manure and the store-bought fertilizer, is that inorganic or the store-bought fertilizer, that nitrogen oftentimes can be available much quicker than nitrogen from manure.
And Darren, I had one question, because you were talking about all the forage production, usually happens essentially in May.
Yep.
For smooth brome, and
Yep.
this year we were pretty cold late. I mean, we've
Yep.
been delayed, so it's not just the lack of moisture that's been
Yep.
set us back, but it's also been the cold. Does that extend our timeline, or are we just kind of out, so to speak? Like, it really still is June 1st is kind of that date by which we.
That's a good question. That kind of gets back to the physiology piece of this. While that cold weather did delay a lot of the early growth, these cool seasons, the smooth brome grass in particular, they do respond to day length as well. So once these, now we're on the increasing day length, that's basically one of the things that triggers the growth function there. And each one of the cool season grasses, they have a different heading date. Okay. And so they respond differently to that increasing light, increasing day length. So, it's in the animal world, Mary, I think you're asking about compensatory growth of the pastures. Is that would that be an equivalent thought?
Or just extending a little later. I mean, if it stays cool, would we be able to go into, June 15th or something like that?
You might buy a little later time, but I don't think it's going to be a great lot. The other thing with the colder temperatures of the soils aren't warming up as quickly either, and that's also soil temperatures need to be on the increase for a lot of this nitrogen to be converted so that the plants can take it up.
No, you made a comment the other day that I thought was really useful in terms of putting on nitrogen. And that is, I'm always worried about trying to get nitrogen on, right before it rains, because I
Yep.
don't volatilize.
Yeah.
You made the comment with the lack of moisture that you won't have as much volatilization. So making sure it's on and ready for rain in this conditions might actually, you might actually have more time of leeway to just get it on and then hope for rain.
Yeah, the temperature is a big factor on the volatilization. High relative humidities are another, and winds, increased wind speeds can also increase the volatilization. Well, fertilizing on a hot, humid day with the wind blowing a gale that's ideal for volatilization. We haven't quite got to that standpoint yet. Probably be more. I'll use the word concern. Might have a bit more concern about that when we start talking about fertilizing warm season pastures, but at least for the cool seasons, won't say that it's a non-issue, but I do think some of that nitrogen volatilization loss is minimized under cooler temperature conditions.
Do we want to move to the next discussion?
Yep. This would be you. Maybe.
Yeah,
There-
so we talk about the hay value, but I wanted to bring in some data from pasture and smooth brome grazing. Because as we all know, hay and grazing are a little bit different in terms of maybe expected responses. And we have a 15-year data set, actually it may be a little bit longer than that now, where they've been putting on 80 pounds of N per acre and comparing it to an unfertilized control and grazing it with yearlings. In eastern Nebraska, of course, it is dry land. And it's on average, they've been getting about 151 day grazing season, and their stocking rate is different depending on whether they fertilize or not. So 3/4 of a calf per acre with the unfertilized, and we increased that to about a calf an acre with 80 pounds of nitrogen. So the difference really in carrying capacity is about 1 AUM per acre on average. So that's a little bit less than what you might expect if you looked at those forage growth responses that we see with hay. And I think probably the difference there is about grazing efficiency, harvest efficiency, so to speak. But we don't see any difference in average daily gain between the two. So from that standpoint, the extra carrying capacity also results in extra gain per acre. So then the question is, depending on if you're thinking about stockers, is that extra gain worth it? If you're thinking about cows, then is the extra AUM worth the cost? Which I think is really interesting. If I compare it to what an AUM for renting pasture is worth right now at 80 cents a pound in, it doesn't look quite as favorable. But if I compare it to having to feed hay, it sure does look very favorable. So it kind of depends on what your alternative is, right? If you have more available pasture, which I know most people don't, like if you could actually get a hold of more pasture, it may not look like a good idea with these really high nitrogen prices. However, with the really high forage prices, especially hay prices, it still looks pretty good. Go to the next slide, Jay. The only thing that I did want to point out, there was no difference in average daily gain. If we look at this slide, I just have 2005 to 2021 data. And so we have the control in blue, which is non-fertilized. Then we have the 80 pounds of N, which is in this orange. And then I have gray, which is supplemented. The supplemented treatment is stocked at the same rate as the fertilized. So basically 1 calf an acre, but they also get 5 pounds of distillers per day. And so, of course, we see a growth response to that. I really just wanted to show you, there's a lot of things on here, but there's a lot of people talking about 2012 and where we're at now relative to 2012. And I did think it's kind of interesting. The one time where we see some responses in terms of differences in average daily gain for those calves is when we're recovering from the drought. We see some improvement, about 1/4 of a pound to 1/2 pound a day gain difference if we had fertilized. And Daren and I kind of talked a little bit about this, like what's going on. Might be something to do with the fact that we do see extra crude protein, and we do in these pastures as well when we fertilize. And perhaps because when in those drought periods, we do see more water soluble carbohydrates, maybe we just have a little bit more energy to take advantage of that extra crude protein. But I did think that was kind of intriguing that, when we do start recovering, not only do we get the extra carrying capacity, but we seem to get some animal responses to doing fertilization as well. So it's kind of a win. Probably not right now, maybe next year, hopefully next year when we get rain. So I did really just want to point out that the response we get on pasture maybe isn't quite as large to those higher rates as what we see with hay in terms of the added forage value. But given our current conditions, if we are going to get some rain, the high costs still probably pencil out. Okay, Daren, we want to go to your top tips.
Yep, so we'll let me move and get my light back on in here so I can see. So this is the last slide. I've tried to summarize a little bit about what we've talked about, and basically came up with I think three strong points here. Effectively, as Jay had talked a little bit about, these high hay prices, they're going to make several options reasonable. However, I think if we look at the inadequate soil moisture that's in many areas of Nebraska, I think that's going to make the 35 pounds of nitrogen rate a more rational option. Also this year, smooth brome grass pastures may need some additional TLC, if you will. The Mary had talked about this a little bit, and I think one of the things that's important is to fertilize in advance of a rain. Don't wait to fertilize after a rain. Some of my thinking on that is, while soils in many areas are dry, are not yet dried out. Fertilizing in advance of the rain is going to do a couple of things. That's going to speed the movement of the nitrogen into the soil, and that's also going to speed the nitrogen uptake by the plants. We talked a little bit earlier today that we're only left with about 45 days until mid-June, at least under good growing conditions, when 75% of that total production should have occurred for dryland pastures. I think, and this refers back to that 35-pound nitrogen rate. The longer I think we think about that, I think that's a balance between taking a little bit of a risk, but not being too crazy under dry land production. If you've got some irrigation, then again, I think your options are pretty open. This is also probably not the year to fertilize with nitrogen only. Given the growing conditions last year and the slow start to the growing season this year, I think it's going to be equally important to consider herbicide application to control pasture weeds as well. This is going to be especially important if you do apply even a small rate of nitrogen, because invariably what we see is that with the slow growth of these grasses, many of our annual weeds don't behave the same way. And so they love it when there's not any competition for the soil moisture or the nitrogen fertilizer. And they are very efficient at stealing that away from our pasture grasses. Kind of on a bigger scale, it's also probably something to think about. That's not going to be important to manage all acres the same. If you've got some pasture areas that are a little bit more productive and they are productive on a year in and year out basis, might be advantageous to think about strategically fertilizing those pastures. That's going to make more effective use of the soil moisture that's available, and also the coming moisture along with the nitrogen fertilization. Another consideration to think about is if there is some soil moisture present, you're in an area where you have got some of these scattered showers. You might also consider increasing the rate on these productive acres to increase the forage yield. That gets a little bit about some of the things that Jay touched on those marginal costs. Effectively, what that's going to do, that's going to reduce the cost, since those application costs are going to be spread across fewer acres. And so those are the three main things that I think we've summarized a bit on our presentation today. And that's all the information, at least I have answered a few questions. We've got about 20 minutes left, Jay. So I think probably we're due for some discussion.
Yeah, thanks, Daren. And once again, if you have any questions, just type them in the Q&A box. We have a question from the classroom in terms of native pastures and recommendations along those lines. If it's not something that like Bromegrass or anything that's been improved on.
Yep.
What are your thoughts on that, and maybe things that people should consider?
And Daren,
on native grasses.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's oftentimes on the true native grasses, in particular the warm seasons, we don't see a great response to nitrogen in pastures unless those are regularly hayed. And then again, we're talking about maybe 40 to 50 pounds if they're regularly hayed. Again, the caution to that is if they were hayed last year, they haven't gotten a lot of regrowth on them yet. You've got the potential there to fertilize the weed crop up as well. So, I that's a hard one to think about for me. On a lot of the sub-irrigated meadows out in the sand hills, while those aren't native, they occasionally do have some natives in them, and those are regularly fertilized with these rates that we're talking about for the Bromegrass, somewhere around 60 pounds an acre.
Okay, I think that is going to answer my next question. This is my question out of being naive, and that is those mixed pastures. Say you're like 70% warm season, 30% cool season.
Yep.
You just, timing is the question because we're dry right now. Question response, is there some advantage to waiting later, knowing that you got a predominantly warm season pasture?
Yeah, exactly. It's this delay that, if you've got a mixed cool, warm season, mixed pasture, early fertilization will favor the cool seasons, later fertilization will favor the warm season.
Okay. And before we move on, somebody wants to know how to kill smooth brome so they can plant something different. A little off topic, but if you want to address that, you will.
And it's that's a pretty common question. The recipe to really kill smooth brome grass is to make sure that it's got some growth on it in the fall, and you spray it before it goes dormant during the winter. That'll get about 90% of it. You spray the rest of it in the spring and do what you want to do.
Okay, and I think this next question comes from the Panhandle. Not 100% sure, but I believe so. We mainly have irrigated salt grasses, not real awesome grass. The harder it is grazed, the better it is. That's the question, or how to fertilize in this situation.
Yeah, I haven't done a lot of work out in the Panhandle, but because the production is lower, the nitrogen fertilization rates are going to be lower. And I go back to some of the work that I've done on cool season annuals, oat in particular, where we've had a same study here in eastern Nebraska, another one with Jerry Valesky out in the west central part of the state, and then Mitch has collaborated with us out in the Panhandle. And oftentimes, at least on the cool season annuals, there is hardly any response to nitrogen fertilization, just because the weather tends to be a bit on the cooler side. I think some of the heavy grazing piece to that is just keeping the kind of the stem elongation at base, so you're just only working with the leaves, which have a much higher quality than the stems, pretty well regardless of the species that you're dealing with for forage.
Okay, and we're kind of on the cusp here in the spring, where if it stays dry, it might be a little late to put some on and whatnot. You want to speak to how effective it is for fall fertilization on a dryland brome pasture?
Yeah, that was on that first two figures I showed about slide 2 or 3. You look at the cool season pastures in the eastern part of the state. Here again, I have no idea what a normal year is, but in a normal year, typically you'll see about 75% of your production, your total yearly production, occur during the spring, and then you'll get about 25% production that occurs in the fall. Now, if we don't get any rain in the spring and our yields don't get anywhere near that 1.5 tons that I was showing for non-fertilized Bermuda grass, we could get much more than that this fall. But generally, the problem with fertilizing in the fall, again, unless there's soil moisture present, because the temperatures they're trending downward during that time. Again, maybe 40 pounds of nitrogen per acre sometime the middle part of September. There again, pray for rain like we're always doing, and you might get close to a ton of production an acre.
Can I ask a follow-up? And it's related to the next question, which is about manure. I know we talked a little bit about manure earlier. And one of the things with manure, right, is the nitrogen isn't as available
Yep.
quickly. So timing for manure application, kind of for optimal response.
Ooh, I don't know that we've got a good have a good answer for that. My inkling would be to have that spread before the grass begins to grow. So a late winter application, much like we do on let the pasture soil freeze and then get with it kind of thing. So fall application, late summer might not be bad. My concern is that applying in particular a heavy rate of manure would be that you would burn that. Effectively you get fertilizer burn on it and slow down the growth.
I thought you were gonna follow up, Mary. Okay. Let's see. We got a producer participation question that I want to cover here. Do you have any thoughts on what percentage of bromegrass pastures in Nebraska are fertilized, maybe historically, and then in particular in the recent years where we've had these dry conditions and high fertilizer costs?
So I don't have a specific answer, and that thinking about that, we don't have a lot of information of how to manage during a drought. And so we have to go back to this information like Mary has there for this 15-year study and kind of pull out the drought years and see what was happening on either side of that to come up with some idea of maybe how we might approach some management. If there's not, and I go back to 2012. Reason I had my Oklahoma flashback is because I was down there in 2012, and so I try to use a lot of that I observed down there and then transfer it up here. So sometimes I transfer where I was located. So again, apologize for that, but it's I think this I can get off kind of get into the climate variability soapbox here. Boy, certainly the precipitation is becoming unpredictable. We either get way too much or not nearly enough. The distribution is not spread out. The challenge that we have, I think we're seeing this year with the smooth bromegrass pastures, and this is not the first year since 2014 when I returned back here, that we've had some colder weather extend into the spring. Actually had happened last year as well, temperature wise. Now we did precipitation was very similar. So right now, 2023, at least during the first part of the year, is very similar to 2022. And from here on out, if you're projecting 23 based on 22, your 23 prognostications are not going to look very good. So, I think historically, smooth bromegrass pastures were fertilized. I think the increase in fertilizer prices, along with the some of the unpredictability of the precipitation, I think that's made us the choice maybe should have been only to reduce the nitrogen and not eliminate it. Although I do think there have been quite a number of pastures that have been eliminated from fertility. I think some of that's also many of these pastures are kind of on the fringes of cropland as well, and they're not used not to be, they're used more as holding areas as opposed to forage resources. So but again, I would have no idea what the current percent is. I'd be hard pressed to guess the number of smooth Bromegrass acres because some of them are so small.
Fair enough. We have an interseeding question, specifically what legume species might be interseeded into Bromegrass stand and when to seed. And it is a legume, so you get the nitrogen.
Yeah.
Back there.
Yeah, and that's one of the things back before Bruce Anderson had retired. That's one of the things he had worked with. We always talk about planting date and all this sort of thing, but I think when we start interseeding legumes into these brome pastures, one of the things that's going to be most critical is that we have the brome short when we do that. The alfalfa can be interseeded in the fall or the spring. I think if you're looking at potentially grazing it, you might want to think about a fall interseeding. Red clover is another one. Again, that one can be. We talk a lot about frost seeding some of the other clovers, during February, early part of March. But again, the brome needs to be very short. One way to have it short, keep it short, is to restrict the nitrogen to it as well. But so there's kind of that balance there between fertility when you're doing that. I think alfalfa to me is it's going to take more grazing management with the alfalfa. The red clover, it doesn't. You have more there than you think you do, but the complaints that you hear about the clovers, it doesn't seem like it's very uniform through the pasture. It tends to grow in patches, so it doesn't look like you have really as much red clover as you do. So I think you can get the alfalfa a little more uniformly distributed through a pasture than you can the red clover.
What's your suggested seeding rates for both of those? So if you were to do alfalfa, what is it? And if you were to try to interseed red clover, what would it be?
Yeah, and on the alfalfa, you can if you pay attention to establishment, you can get a pure alfalfa stand with about 10 or 12 pounds of seed. So somewhere, less than half of that, 4 to 5 pounds, 6 pounds would be a pretty good starting point. Same type of thing on the clover. It doesn't take a lot of clover seed to get that established. The big difference between the alfalfa and the red clover, you can broadcast seed the red clover. It doesn't have to be drill planted. That alfalfa would not do worth a hoot broadcast.
Can I ask one more follow-up question?
Yep.
It's about varieties. I know there are grazing varieties of alfalfa. Is that suggested in that type of situation, or does it not really matter in an interseeded situation?
I don't think it matters in an interseeded situation. My experience with those grazing alfalfas, they have a more low growing, a decumbent growth habit. And those plants typically don't have the production potential that the more upright ones do.
And back to the nitrogen fertilizer, is it best to apply it in liquid form or dry?
Don't think it makes any difference.
I'll ask a follow-up question on that, because I know with liquid in particular, if you get up on those higher rates, you can burn forage back. So is there a recommended application maximum, so to speak, for the different rates or the different forms, excuse me?
Some of the data that I'm aware of is let me think about how to, if you're putting on 100 pounds or less, you can more or less apply that as in a single application. Now, given on dry land, you're probably not going to apply 100 pounds. So, if you go with the 70 to 80 pounds on dry land, are you better to split that into something along the line of 35 to 40 pounds and split apply? And the answer to that's no.
Okay, and just to finish up, in terms of quantity to apply, let's switch back to the manure. How much would you suggest putting on there in terms of pounds of manure, or however you quantify that? I'm not sure.
I think they quantify it by tons. There again, the nutrient composition of that manure, and you shoot for some kind of reasonable nitrogen application. I don't think you want to put 20 tons of manure per acre out per year like you do on the some of the cropland, but somewhere a half to somewhere a little south of a half of that would get pretty well in the ballpark.
Okay, and just to put a plug in, I know that we have some NEB guides on the importance of sampling your manure to know it's there, how you want to use it, and some people that do that for you and so on. So feel free to look those up.
Yep, not all manure is created equally.
Yeah, we know that. All right, well, we're pretty much ready to wrap up here. Thanks, Daren and Mary, for your insight today. Great presentation, and thanks to everybody online that joined us today and asked all the great questions. Really appreciate that. And so does everybody else that was on, and everybody enjoys listening to questions being answered. So just a reminder, recording will be posted of this webinar at our website, cap.unl.edu. You'll also be able to register for our other upcoming webinars. Next week, I know that we have a webinar with the Farm Service Agency looking at some of the disaster programs that have already become available in parts of the state due to the drought. So you won't want to miss that. So that'll be next Thursday at noon. Brad Lubin will be hosting that with some folks from the Farm Service Agency to go through those programs. When you close your window and exit Zoom, you'll get a short 3-question survey. We really appreciate your feedback, not only on today's webinar, but also ideas for future webinars, both topics and speakers, because we really want to make these webinars serve our public and answer the questions they want answered and provide the information they would like to see. So with that, one last thank you to Mary and Daren. Great program, and thanks again to all of you online for joining us, and wish everybody a great rest of today.
Yep, thanks very much.